The meeting was supposed to last 30 minutes. I had been watching Victor Shaw pace the front of the glass conference room for almost an hour, selling the room on a deal that I already knew was going to destroy everything the company had spent years building. 12 executives sat around the table, tablets open, pens ready. Outside the glass walls, the rest of the office moved through its normal Tuesday morning routine, completely unaware. Inside, everything felt wrong. My name is Patrick Hayes. At the time, I was the senior compliance analyst at Vantara Holdings, a mid-sized trading company that had spent 3 years trying to break into international markets. I had been there for 6 years. I knew every contract, every clause, every supplier relationship the company had ever built. And what Victor was about to sign, I knew deep in my bones that it was a trap. I raised my hand. Victor stopped mid-sentence. "Patrick," he said, with the kind of smile people use when they are not actually happy to see you. "Something on your mind?" I stood up. I told him clearly, calmly, and in front of everyone in that room, that the deal he was about to sign contained a regulatory risk that could destroy the company's entire international expansion. The overseas supplier linked to the contract was already under investigation by international regulators. Signing would tie Vantara Holdings directly to whatever came next. Victor laughed. He called it paranoid sabotage. Said I was trying to derail something I didn't understand. "You're done, Patrick. Security will escort you out." I picked up my folder and said the only thing left to say. "I hope you're right, because if you're wrong, today was your biggest mistake." He signed the deal 10 minutes later. The walk from that conference room to the lobby felt like it lasted forever. Someone from HR brought me a cardboard box. Small, brown, slightly crushed at one corner. I stood at my desk and placed 6 years of my professional life into it. A framed photo of my daughter's first birthday, a small plant I'd been growing on my windowsill since I joined the company, and a notepad full of contract notes that nobody else would ever bother to read. Nobody said anything to me, not one coworker. They looked at their screens, their phones, anywhere that wasn't me. One woman I used to eat lunch with every Friday turned her chair slightly away as I walked past. I understood. Fear does that to people. Watching someone get fired is a quiet reminder that the same thing could happen to you. I carried the box toward the elevator, keeping my back straight and my breathing steady. I had been in enough difficult situations to know that the worst thing you can do in a moment like that is let them see exactly how much it hurts. The elevator doors opened. I stepped in, and then my phone vibrated. It was a message from a blocked number. 3 words. They signed it. I stood in that elevator with the box in my arms, staring at the screen as the doors slid shut. The lobby disappeared behind the polished metal panels. I felt the floor drop beneath me as the elevator began its descent. I whispered quietly into the empty space around me. Then the clock just started. I drove home without the radio on. The silence felt necessary. I needed to think, and thinking required space. For the past 3 weeks, I had been sitting with information that nobody at Vantara Holdings wanted to hear. It started on a Wednesday evening, late, when most of the building had already emptied. I was reviewing contract documentation for the upcoming partnership deal. Victor had been pushing the company hard toward a major expansion into overseas trade markets, and I was the one responsible for making sure the legal details were clean before anything moved forward. That was when I found it. Buried deep in the contract appendix was a compliance clause tied directly to our primary overseas supplier, Corbis International. The clause required that all supplier partners remain in good regulatory standing throughout the full contract period. It was standard language, the kind of thing most people skim past without a second look. But when I cross-referenced Corbis International against a regulatory watch database I subscribed to personally, a red flag appeared. Corbis International was under active investigation by international regulators for trade violations. If sanctions were ever formally issued against Corbis, our contract with them would become legally questionable overnight. Every agreement built on that foundation could collapse. I had brought this to leadership privately. A written memo to Victor's office. A follow-up meeting with 2 senior directors. Both times I was told the concern had been reviewed and dismissed. Today had been my final attempt. And I still had every document I had ever found. By mid-afternoon, my former company was celebrating. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open, watching it happen in real time. Victor had posted a photo on the company's official social media page. He was standing in the conference room, champagne glass raised, surrounded by the same 12 executives who had watched me get walked out that morning. The caption read, "Historic day for Vantara Holdings. Our biggest international expansion begins now." He had tagged the company's investors, financial publications that followed the industry, and 3 different business news accounts. Within 2 hours, the post had hundreds of congratulatory comments. Business journalists were already writing short articles about the deal. Investors were responding publicly with excitement. The announcement was being shared across financial forums and professional networks. From the outside, it looked like the beginning of something great. From where I was sitting, it looked like a building with smoke already rising quietly from the basement, while everyone on the roof took photographs. I closed the social media tab. I opened the Regulatory Watch database I had been checking for the past 3 weeks and ran a fresh search on Corbus International. Nothing had changed yet. The investigation was still ongoing, still unpublicized in any major outlet, still the kind of information that only appeared if you were specifically looking for it. I made myself a cup of coffee and sat back down. And then, while scrolling through a financial news aggregator I followed, I noticed something small. A short article, published by a financial blog I recognized, mentioned Corbus International by name. The article was easy to miss. It was buried near the bottom of a roundup post about international trade disputes, 3 paragraphs from the end, sandwiched between 2 stories about unrelated commodity markets. The headline of the post didn't hint at what was inside. Most people scrolling through their feeds would never have clicked it, and even those who had would have stopped reading long before reaching the paragraph that mattered. But I read every word. The article stated that Corbus International had come under scrutiny from the Global Trade Compliance Authority, a regulatory body that oversaw international supplier standards across multiple jurisdictions. The investigation had been triggered after a pattern of irregular trade filings was detected over 18 months. No formal decision had been reached yet. The piece framed it as a developing story, the kind of footnote in business news that disappears quietly from public view within days if nothing escalates. Nobody at Vantara Holdings would see this. I was certain of that. Victor didn't read financial blogs. His senior team relied on curated briefings prepared by junior staff trained to flag growth opportunities, not regulatory risk. This article would never make it into any briefing. It would sit quietly in a corner of the internet while the company celebrated. I understood how these investigations worked. I had spent years studying them. When a case like this reached the point where it was being mentioned publicly, even briefly, it meant things were accelerating behind closed doors. Then an email notification appeared at the top of my screen. An unfamiliar name sat in my inbox. The email was from someone named Ray Owens. His message was short and professional. He introduced himself as a former legal consultant who had worked with Corbus International until 8 months earlier. He said he had come across my name through a mutual industry contact, someone who knew I had been raising concerns about the Corbus situation internally at Vantara Holdings. He wanted to talk. We scheduled a call for that same evening. When his face appeared on my screen, he looked tired in the way that people do when they have been carrying something heavy for a long time. Ray told me everything. He had attempted to warn Vantara Holdings himself, weeks before I had even raised the issue internally. He had reached out to Victor's office directly and been redirected to a junior procurement assistant who apparently never passed the message along. After that, he tried emailing 3 separate directors. No response. He confirmed what my research had already shown. Corbus International was not simply under investigation, it was on the verge of formal sanctions. The violations involved falsified trade certification documents across 4 different countries. The Global Trade Compliance Authority had been quietly building its case for over a year. Once formal sanctions were issued, any company that had signed contracts with Corbis during the investigation period would likely be flagged for a compliance review. Ray paused. Then he asked the question in a voice that already seemed to know the answer. Did your CEO sign the contract already? I looked at him through the screen. This morning, I said, in front of 12 witnesses. The days that followed were harder than I expected. I had told myself that being fired would feel like a relief, like finally putting down something that had been growing heavier by the month. Instead, it felt like standing outside in the cold, watching the inside of a warm house through a lit window, knowing exactly what was about to happen to the people inside. Vanterra Holdings wasn't slowing down. It was speeding up. 2 days after the signing, Victor announced an even larger rollout linked to the Corbis deal. He was planning to open 2 new distribution channels using the supplier network. A company-wide memo described it as the beginning of a new era of growth. The news circulated through industry contacts, and I heard from people I still knew inside the building that employees were being told the expansion would create new positions and promotion opportunities. I also heard what those same people were saying about me. The story going around was that I had lost my nerve. That I had raised a concern I couldn't back up because I was struggling with the pressure of the role. Someone described my warning as a meltdown. Another version said I had been trying to protect my own position. Listening to it stung more than I expected. Not because it surprised me, but because I knew why it was happening. When someone gets fired, the easiest story to tell is that they deserved it. But underneath all of it, I noticed something the people inside that building probably hadn't. Regulators were beginning to ask quiet questions. I had seen the first signs in a procurement industry newsletter I still received daily. Nothing obvious yet, just the early tremors of something building. The movement became official 3 weeks later. A government body called the Office of International Trade Accountability formally contacted Vanterra Holdings. They requested all documentation related to the Corbis International Partnership, including the signed contract, supplier verification records, and any internal risk assessments completed before signing. I heard about it within hours of it happening, through a contact who was still inside the building. Victor told his team it was routine. He said every company with international supplier relationships received these kinds of requests from time to time. He assured his senior team that legal would handle it and that the expansion timeline would not change. But I knew that wasn't how the Office of International Trade Accountability operated. They didn't send documentation requests unless they already had a specific reason to look at a particular company. What I didn't expect was the call I received 4 days after that. It came from a number I still had saved in my phone. Diane Park. She had been a senior director at Vanterra Holdings for 5 years, one of the few people there who had always treated my work with genuine respect. She had been in the conference room the morning I was fired. She had watched Victor escort me out without saying a single word. Her voice on the phone was careful. She asked how I was. Then she paused a moment too long before asking the real question. Patrick, she said quietly. Was the warning real? What you said in that meeting, was it actually real? I took a slow breath. Every word of it, I said. Diane went quiet on the other end of the line. I gave her space. I didn't rush to fill the silence or soften what I had already said. She needed a moment to understand what those words meant, and I had learned a long time ago that honesty lands harder when you let it settle. When she spoke again, her voice was lower. Walk me through it, she said. All of it. So I did. I explained the compliance clause buried in the contract appendix. I explained how Corbis International had appeared as a flagged entity on the Regulatory Watch database I used, and how that flag had been active for months before the signing. I told her what Ray Owens had confirmed about the formal sanctions being prepared. Then I walked her through the regulatory chain reaction that would follow. Once sanctions were officially issued against Corbis, every company that had signed with them during the investigation period would face compliance reviews. Those reviews could freeze accounts, halt market access, and in serious cases, trigger financial penalties. Vanterra Holdings hadn't just signed with Corbis. It had signed while Corbis was already under active investigation. That distinction mattered enormously to regulators. Diane was quiet for a long time. Then she asked the question that told me she already understood how serious this was. Is there anything we can do to stop what's coming? I thought about it honestly. Start documenting everything that happened before the signing, I said. And you might want to check tomorrow's morning news. She asked why. You'll understand when you see it. I set my alarm for 5:45 the next morning. I was already at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee when the announcement came through at 6:12. The Global Trade Compliance Authority issued a formal sanctions notice against Corbis International at 6 a.m. Eastern Time. The statement was detailed and specific. Corbis International had been found in violation of international trade regulations for falsifying certification documents across 4 jurisdictions over a period of 22 months. Their operating license had been suspended pending a full financial audit. All existing contracts with certified partners were flagged for immediate compliance review. Within 30 minutes, 3 major financial news outlets had the story. By 7 a.m., Vantara Holdings stock had dropped 4%. By 9 a.m., it had dropped 9%. I watched the numbers move on a market tracking application I had open on my phone. I want to be clear, I wasn't happy about it. Watching a company where I had spent 6 years of my career lose value didn't feel like a victory. It felt like watching a fire that could have been prevented burn through something people had built carefully over years. But I had tried to stop it. More than once. By mid-morning, investor accounts on financial platforms were asking questions publicly. Where was the risk assessment before signing? Who approved this supplier? Was any internal review conducted before the deal was finalized? Those questions had answers. And every answer lived in the documents I had saved, copied, and locked in a personal encrypted folder on the night I first discovered the problem. The board called an emergency meeting that afternoon. I didn't know this immediately. I learned it the following morning from Diane, who sent me a brief message that said only, "It's getting serious. They mentioned your name." I sat with that message for a long time. The board had been tracking the stock movement and the investor questions closely. They had received the documentation request from the Office of International Trade Accountability. They were now facing public pressure from shareholders who wanted to understand how the company had entered a partnership with a supplier already under international investigation. From what Diane told me later, Victor had walked into that emergency meeting with the same confidence he always carried into every room. He stood at the front and explained that the situation was manageable. That the regulatory contact was standard procedure. That the company had conducted appropriate due diligence before signing and that any suggestion otherwise was an exaggeration. The board had already been asking questions. A board member raised the issue of the internal warning that had been flagged before the signing. Victor dismissed it. He said the concern had come from an employee who had been struggling with the demands of the role, that the warning had been reviewed, and that it had been found to be without merit. The room didn't respond the way he expected. One board member, a quiet woman named Patricia Hale who rarely spoke unless she had already made up her mind, leaned forward slowly. "Pull up the recording of that meeting," she said. Nobody moved for a moment. Then someone opened a laptop. All conference rooms at Vantara Holdings had been recorded automatically for 3 years, part of a security protocol that Victor himself had approved after a dispute with a former partner company over what had been said during a negotiation. The recording from Tuesday morning played on a screen at the front of the boardroom. I wasn't there. But Diane described it to me in careful detail afterward. On the screen, 12 executives sat around the conference table. Victor stood at the front, mid-presentation. And then, clearly visible near the middle of the table, I stood up and interrupted him. My voice on the recording was calm. There was no raised tone, no panic, no desperation in what I said. I explained the compliance clause. I named Corbis International. I stated clearly that the supplier was under active investigation by international regulators and that signing while that investigation was ongoing created a direct legal exposure for the company. Victor's response on the recording was to laugh. Then he fired me. Diane said the boardroom went completely still when the recording ended. Patricia Hale spoke again. Her voice, according to Diane, was steady and quiet, the kind of voice that carries more weight because it doesn't need to be raised. He told you exactly what would happen, she said. Before it happened. Victor tried to speak. Patricia stopped him. Where is he now? She asked. The room stayed silent. Nobody had a good answer. The story reached the public faster than I expected. I was at home on a Thursday evening, 2 days after the board's emergency meeting, when my phone began filling with news alerts. A financial journalist who covered corporate governance published a piece under the headline, "Did Vantara Holdings fire the employee who tried to save them?" The article was thorough. It described the company's decision to sign with Corbis International despite the supplier's regulatory status. It outlined the sanctions announcement and the stock drop that followed. And midway through, it mentioned that a senior internal analyst had raised formal concerns about the deal before signing and had been dismissed on the same day the contract was executed. The article didn't use my name, but it didn't need to. Within 6 hours, the piece had been shared thousands of times across professional networks and financial forums. Comments were overwhelming in one direction. People were furious, not at me, at the company. Words like cover-up and whistleblower appeared repeatedly. People with corporate compliance experience were writing detailed threads explaining exactly why what Victor had done was both financially reckless and ethically troubling. By Friday morning, 2 television financial programs had requested official comment from Vantara Holdings. The communications team released a short, carefully worded statement saying the company took all internal feedback seriously and that a review was underway. Then Victor gave his own statement. And that was when the situation shifted from serious to something much worse. Victor made a mistake that surprised even me. He gave an interview to a financial news program on Friday morning. He sat in the company's lobby, well-dressed and composed, and told the interviewer with complete confidence that no formal warning about the Corbis International deal had ever been raised internally before the contract was signed. I watched it at home. I had to replay the clip 3 times to make sure I had heard it correctly. He was looking directly into the camera and stating, on record, that nobody had warned him. The problem was that 12 people had been in that conference room when I did exactly that. And the room had a security recording that played back every word I had said. Within hours of the interview airing, emails began to surface. Multiple employees inside Vantara Holdings, people who had been watching quietly from the inside and growing increasingly uncomfortable with what was happening, began forwarding internal communications. They sent them to the journalist who had published the original story. The emails included my original memo to Victor's office. They included the follow-up meeting notes from my conversation with 2 senior directors. They included an internal message chain from the morning of the signing in which 2 executives briefly discussed my concerns before the meeting began. The documentation was irrefutable. Victor hadn't just ignored a warning. He had now publicly denied that the warning ever existed. That distinction mattered enormously. By Saturday morning, Vantara Holdings board had launched a formal internal investigation into every decision connected to the Corbis contract. The company's legal team had a very difficult weekend. My phone became a different kind of busy after that. For the first several days following Victor's interview, I had received messages of support from former colleagues and contacts across the industry. Those messages were kind, but I wasn't looking for sympathy. What I was focused on was figuring out what came next for me personally. And then the calls from competitors began. The first came from a director at Crestfield Partners, a firm that specialized in international trade advisory services. They had been following the Vantara Holdings situation closely, not out of curiosity, but because they operated in the same sector. The director told me plainly, without any flattery, that the accuracy of my regulatory prediction had impressed their leadership team. They had run their own analysis after the Corbis sanctions were announced and confirmed that the risk pattern I had identified was something their own team had not flagged in time. They were offering me a senior leadership position. I told them I was genuinely interested but that I needed time before making any commitments. There were things I still needed to resolve first. 2 days after that conversation, while I was still weighing my options, my phone rang. The number was from Vanterra Holdings' main corporate line. I stared at the screen for a long moment. 6 weeks ago, that same number had called to confirm that my building access card had been deactivated and that my final paycheck would arrive by post. I answered it anyway. It was the company's head of legal, a man named Howard Britton, who did most of the talking. He was professional, polite, and very careful with his words, in the way that lawyers always are when they are about to make an offer that benefits their client more than it benefits you. The company, he explained, was in a sensitive position. The media attention surrounding the internal warning and the subsequent signing had created what he called a narrative problem. The board was navigating a complex situation with shareholders and regulators, and it would be very helpful, he said, if I were willing to provide a brief public statement clarifying that my warning had been based on incomplete information and that the risk, at the time of signing, had not been clearly established. In exchange, the company was prepared to offer a financial settlement. I let him finish. Then I told him, calmly and without any anger, that I would not be providing that statement. The warning had been based on complete and accurate information. The risk had been clearly established. The sanctions announcement, the stock drop, and the formal regulatory investigation now underway all confirmed exactly that. I had no intention of publicly stating otherwise, regardless of what was being offered. Howard Britton thanked me for my time and ended the call with the practiced politeness of someone who had expected this answer. 3 days later, I received a separate message from Diane. The board had scheduled a formal leadership review. Victor Shaw would be required to appear before them and account for every decision made in connection with the Corbus International contract. The leadership review lasted 2 full days. I wasn't in the room. I didn't need to be. What happened inside those sessions reached me through Diane's careful, measured messages and through the news coverage that began appearing before the review was even finished. Victor had walked into the first session the same way he walked into every room, shoulders back, voice steady, the performance of a man who believed that confidence alone could change the direction of an argument. He presented his defense in organized points. He referenced the company's growth targets. He described the Corbus partnership as a calculated decision made in good faith based on the information available at the time. The board had already seen the security recording. They had already reviewed the emails. They had already read my original memo and the follow-up meeting notes. They had already watched his television interview. Each piece of evidence didn't just contradict his defense. It dismantled it, quietly and completely, the way water wears down something that was never built to last. Patricia Hale led the questioning on the second day. Diane told me later that Patricia was methodical, thorough, and completely without emotion, which was somehow more damaging to Victor than anger would have been. She laid each fact down one after another and simply asked him to explain it. He couldn't. By the end of the second session, the board had reached its conclusion. Victor Shaw was asked to resign immediately. He did not argue. He cleared his office that same afternoon. The deal was officially terminated the following week. Vanterra Holdings' legal team sent formal notice to Corbus International that the partnership contract was void under the compliance clause, the same clause I had identified months earlier and raised in front of 12 witnesses. The clause required all supplier partners to remain in good regulatory standing throughout the full contract period. With formal sanctions now in place, Corbus International no longer met that standard. The termination came with a significant financial cost. Contract exit penalties, legal fees, and the investment already committed to the expansion rollout added up to a figure that the company's next quarterly report would have to account for publicly. Analysts placed the total loss in the range of several $million. Shareholders were not patient about it. An open letter signed by a group of investors called for new leadership and a complete overhaul of the company's internal risk review process. They specifically requested that the board establish clear protocols for handling compliance concerns, with direct board-level oversight built in from the start. Inside the company, something had shifted. I heard this from Diane and from a few other former colleagues who reached out during that week. People were talking about what had happened differently now. The story about me losing my nerve had quietly disappeared. In its place was a different kind of conversation, one about what it had truly cost the company to ignore the one person who had been trying to protect it. The board reached out to me directly that Thursday afternoon. They asked if I would be willing to meet. I agreed to meet with the board, but not because I was considering going back. That decision had already been made, quietly, without drama, the day after Victor's resignation. The meeting was held at a neutral location, a conference room inside a downtown legal office that Vantara Holdings used for sensitive matters. Patricia Hale was there, along with 2 other board members I recognized. The atmosphere was formal but not uncomfortable. Nobody pretended the past 2 months hadn't happened. Patricia spoke first. She thanked me directly for the integrity I had shown, both in raising the warning and in declining the settlement offer. She acknowledged that the board's failure to act on my concerns earlier was something they were treating as an organizational failure, not just a leadership one. I listened with respect. Then I told them, with the same calm I had tried to carry since the morning I was escorted from the building, that I would not be returning to Vantara Holdings. I had already accepted the position at Crestfield Partners. In my new role, I would have full authority over risk assessment decisions for all international partnerships. No memos that disappeared into someone's inbox. No follow-up meetings where careful concerns were reviewed and casually dismissed. My judgment would carry actual weight, and the people I would be working with had already demonstrated that they understood the difference between risk management and paranoia. Patricia shook my hand at the door when we finished. "You handled this with more grace than most people would have," she said. I appreciated it. But grace had nothing to do with it. I had simply done what I always did. The work. It has been 5 months now. My office at Crestfield Partners is on the 14th floor, corner side, with a window that looks out over the city in the early morning light. It is mine. Not company property. Not a desk I am borrowing while someone decides whether to keep me. Mine. I think about Vantara Holdings sometimes. Not with bitterness, but with the kind of clear understanding that comes when enough time has passed for the dust to settle. The company is still operating. New leadership moved in quickly. New protocols were put in place. The stock recovered slowly, and from what I have read in industry coverage, the organization is rebuilding itself with a different culture around risk and compliance. I hope they get it right. At Crestfield Partners, we closed our first major international deal last month. Clean documentation, fully verified supplier relationships, and a risk review process that I designed from the ground up. 18 countries. Not a single regulatory flag raised at signing. I sat at the head of the table when we finalized it. Nobody laughed when I raised a concern during the review phase. Nobody called it paranoid. The team leaned in, asked questions, and took every note seriously. That is what it is supposed to feel like. I think about Victor sometimes too. Not with anger. Just a quiet understanding of what his story teaches. He had everything he needed to make the right call that morning. He simply chose not to listen. And sometimes, the most expensive decision a leader ever makes is firing the one person who was trying to save them. If this story reached you today, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you have ever been the person in that room, speaking clearly while everyone looked away, drop it in the comments below. Tell me where you are watching from. Remember, you are not alone.